Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us at this session. My name is Salman. I lead the AWS Generative AI business with Global Partners, and I'm joined here by my colleague Priya, who heads the Generative AI Center of Excellence for AWS Partners. Just out of interest, how many of you are from an AWS partner organization? Just by show of hands, please. Cool, amazing, fantastic. Thank you so much. So we're going to be talking about ROI. It's a topic that has become increasingly more important. In fact, it's one of the factors that is really affecting the adoption of generative AI in businesses. And in the next 1 hour or 40 minutes, we're going to be talking about 4 topics. First one is, why is it important? What is it? How do we compute it? What's the theory behind it? The second one is that we're going to be walking you through an illustrative use case, a real use case. How do you compute it? How do the numbers come together? How do we measure the ROI? The third topic we're going to be covering is, what are some of the best practices? What are the shortfalls? What are the pitfalls? What are the things to watch out for? What are the things we've seen from many generative AI projects in business? And last but not least is, where can you get more information about this, right? So a set of online resources for you to follow up, upskill, and become more equipped in this area. So with that in mind, I'm going to start. And oh boy, generative AI has had a rapid adoption, right? In fact, probably one of the steepest adoption in comparison to any other technology in our time. Recently, I saw a stat highlighting that US companies just last year spent 6 times more on AI than any other year. VCs have committed to $6 billion over the last 3 years with startups focused on generative AI. And this market size today from 15 billion is estimated to grow to 120 billion by 2030. But the question is, why? What's so special about this technology? If I have to sum it up in one phrase, it's the fact that generative AI has truly reduced the barrier to innovation. What do I mean by that? Before generative AI, any organization trying to adopt AI/ML, they needed to have a sufficiently large labeled set of data set samples in order to be able to train the model for that specific purpose or task. Now these generative AI models come pre-trained. They have some pre-built capabilities. So what happens is that only with a handful of good examples, in fact, in certain times, you can actually just with clever prompting and instructions, you can get them to focus and start performing for a specific task. That really helps organizations to start that journey. Data becomes important, but that starting point, as I highlighted, is extremely important. And we see it. We see it now getting infused and adopted across the industry, and we see many successful use cases. In fact, one of the resources that we have for this is, if you search on our website for AI Explorer, there are many customer stories related to generative AI that have been published, and you can look at. We have examples from a retail firm who's realized 1.5 times improvement on the conversion rate by using image generation for fashion. We have examples where in drug discovery, drugs have been discovered over days as opposed to traditionally where usually it's years. We have examples where we see in insurance, customers have realized 30% reduction in customer service costs. This highlights the point that I highlighted on the previous slide on how it's become easy to start off, how generative AI is getting infused into every business process and function. And that's the vision that we have for this technology. It's not going to be sitting on the side. In the same way that data is integral to any business function or process, soon we're going to have generative AI becoming integral in any of these business processes and functions. Now, the next point I want to highlight is identifying the right use case is so important and so key. I like this case study where Pfizer has estimated a 750 to a billion cost saving by adopting generative AI. And this is a time when Priya and myself are examining and talking to many customers, many partners, where people are really trying to figure out where's the ROI, hoping to have the returns meet the investments that are being happening up front. And we have case studies like this. So how does that happen, right? So ROI, whilst it's a useful tool in order to filter the use cases, identify the right ones, it's a useful tool in order to validate the business case. It's a great tool in order to gain buy-in from the line of business for the acceptance of this solution and adoption at scale. In itself, does not generate or does not discover these use cases. It's imperative and important to really think about the business, right? What is the business pain points? What are the opportunities? What is the strategic ambition of the business in order to identify the right and appropriate use cases? And in this case, Pfizer identified that leveraging this close to drug discovery, clinical trials, the research aspect that is highly computational, it takes time. Adopting and identifying 17 different use cases, that has led them to identify opportunities, highlighting this kind of returns. Now, with that said, I'm going to hand over to Priya, who's going to be talking about the role of partners, importance of our ROI, and what is it, and then get us started on this illustrative use case. Priya, there you go.
Thank you. So I hope all of you took away or I should say, what I took away listening to Salman is we've seen an evolution in the conversation of generative AI. So a year ago, we were talking about what is the technology. We were talking about what can it do. But now the conversation has shifted to what is the value that can be delivered with generative AI. And we've talked a lot about our experiences, our conversations, but before we kind of dive into the mechanics of ROI, I wanted to also share what we're hearing from our customers. So as the global lead for the Generative AI Center of Excellence, we provide resources for AWS Partners, and I'll share a little bit more about how you can access that towards the end of this presentation. But one of the things that we do on an annual basis is we survey our customers. And one of the questions that we've been asking them over the last 2 years is how important is ROI when you're considering your use cases, when you're considering investing in generative AI? And I think one of the things that was fascinating to me, I have a business background, right? I think ROI first all the time, but one of the things that was really fascinating a year ago is that ROI was not a top consideration. It was not a key deciding factor in what use cases people were applying or even if they were going to invest in generative AI. Now, fast forward a year later and looking into 2025, this has grown in importance across the board. And not only are customers more keeping the ROI considerations of Gen AI up front and center, but they also have clear benchmarks that they're trying to hit. So having a very robust approach to evaluating and understanding ROI is critical in their use case evaluation. So at the beginning of this presentation, we asked, who is a partner in the room? And one of the reasons we asked that question is Salman and I both support our AWS partner organization. We work very closely with our partners, talking to our customers on a day in, day out basis. And one of the things that we're also understanding is that partners can play a critical role in helping our customers and understanding ROI. And part of that reason is twofold. First is ROI is not a point-in-time conversation. You don't sit there, look at your use case, evaluate ROI, and then go put it on a shelf and worry about it later. It needs to be a constant conversation throughout your generative AI adoption journey. And this can be challenging. Well, it can be beneficial, but it can be challenging because what we're seeing with generative AI is that the demand's evolving so quickly. The technology is evolving, the models are evolving, the prices associated with it are evolving. And that means that you have to really reevaluate and consider ROI at every phase of your adoption journey. And the precision of your ROI estimate should continue to evolve as you do that analysis over and over again. And that's why I would say AWS Partners are uniquely positioned to help our customers do that, both because they have of their deep domain knowledge and expertise. We work very closely with their AWS partners to make sure they understand what features are coming out, how to use it, the best architecture choices, but also because you as customers that are in the room are telling us that more than 85% of the time that you're looking to partners to outsource your generative AI adoption journey across the full spectrum of that journey. So starting with use case evaluation, but all the way to scaled adoption, governance, and management. So now we've talked a little bit about why it's important for the customers in the room, why you may want to engage your partners, and for the partners in the room, why you want to invest in really having a structured approach to evaluating ROI. So now let's talk about how do you do that. So at its core, ROI is a fairly simple calculation. It's made up of business value over direct costs and indirect costs. Now, while this is a simple mathematical calculation, there's a lot of complexities when you look at it, especially when you're looking at generative AI. So I'm just going to dive in a little bit and tell you kind of from my perspective and Salman's experience as well about where we're seeing some of the biggest challenges and the opportunity to continue to evolve your, or maybe another way to say is to improve or evolve the way you're looking at your generative AI ROI calculations. So the first component that I would say most people are familiar with is direct costs. So when we sit down and work with partners, when we evaluate costs for customers, this is where we spend a majority of our time today. It should include and should start with the cost of your data, both data storage, data cleansing, as well as the direct costs obviously associated with the model costs or fine tuning. That being said, while we have spent a lot of time here, I think one of the biggest opportunities that we still see in maturing our calculations here is having a good understanding of what are the key architecture and strategic decisions that influence the choices here. And this is, again, where partners can play a significant role of saying, aligning both your strategic priorities and the choices in your architecture design for how you deploy GenAI to maximize the ROI. The second component of ROI that I'll address quickly is indirect cost. From my perspective, this cost is often the most overlooked. But it has the potential to be up to 70% of your total cost when you're looking at full deployment. And to a certain degree, I kind of recognize and understand that why it's overlooked. And that's because in the last year or so, most people have been approaching this as a use case and evaluating and testing that first use case to go to market. And when you look at it that way, the total cost of your indirect costs can be minimal. But when you start thinking about 2025 and people looking at true business transformation, so how do they deploy GenAI across their entire business, then these costs become significantly more important and critical to our customers being able to scale effectively and in a trusted manner. And then the third component, I went a little backwards there on purpose, but the third component is business value. And I would say this is where we've seen both our customers and partners struggle the most in being able to articulate the business value associated with GenAI ROI. And a big part of that is because people are struggling to be able to put and articulate the direct impact and value from investing in generative AI, but also we often see people stopping short of expressing it in dollar investments. So we hear a lot of conversations around input metrics, model performance, but there's a lot of value in taking those metrics and then going all the way to dollar value that can be realized with these investments. So we'll talk a little bit about these challenges, opportunities, and some of the best practices we see in all of these areas over the next few slides. So to do that, we're going to leverage a pretty simple use case, but important use case, one that's actually quite prevalent in the market today. So we're going to talk about a marketing use case for a global restaurant chain that is looking to augment their average revenue for existing customers through personalized email marketing campaign. We picked this use case, as I mentioned, because it's very relevant. So marketing and sales use cases have grown year over year as one of the top use cases that are actually being implemented. Have grown in the top use cases I've been implementing since last year. And personalized email is one of the top use cases under the category of marketing and sales. What we're seeing in general is that last year, a big focus had been around internal optimization and employee experience optimization. And now we're starting to see an important shift towards investing in use cases that drive incremental revenue. So we thought this would be a good example to start off with. So as you look at evaluating ROI, there's three things that we would want you to start with. So first, what you want to start with is being very clear on what are we trying to achieve. And then understanding where we are today. And then lastly is understanding or having a hypothesis of how you're going to achieve this. So let me talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. So what are you trying to achieve? Most generative AI use cases can be categorized into three broad categories for business value: boosting employee productivity, optimizing business processes, and enhancing customer experiences. And you're going to see some overlap. So they're not going to be entirely MECE, meaning that you're going to see some of these use cases that have benefits in multiple categories. But what you're going to want to anchor on is what is the primary reason you as a customer or partners as your customer is looking to invest in generative AI? Like what's their primary business motivator to select that specific use case? So that's the first thing you want to do is understand why you're doing it and understand the metrics that would support measuring if that use case is effective. Then you want to move into understanding, okay, so I know this is what I'm trying to improve, so where am I today? So in our example, the metrics that we're going to keep top of mind or that we're going to focus on optimizing is the current campaign open rate, so the email open rate of the email promotions going out, and then the conversion rate. How many of the customers that are opening that email are then leveraging the incentive or the coupon or the promotion being articulated in that email to come into the store? So those are the metrics that we're going to keep top of mind to evaluate the success or the effectiveness of this generative AI campaign. And then you want to start thinking about how are you going to do it. So we know what we're trying to do. We're knowing what our benchmarks are. Now, how do you want to approach this? And this is when you start getting into architecture choices, starts getting into understanding what kind of data are you going to need to use. And we'll go through that in much more detail in the next few slides. But one thing I do want to call out, most of these categories will be applicable to most of our use cases. So we have a couple of example subcategories of where the main expenses are. But one thing you really want to understand is in your early hypotheses is where do you think a majority of your expenses, or what are the most critical components to your strategy or to the architecture choices that you're making? And you want to prioritize those for where you do deep dives and do detail analysis. So that gets us to kind of the broad strategy. So now let's go through each of these sections and start actually applying this to our use case. So the first thing we want to do now is we know what metrics we're trying to influence. We want to work on understanding now what's the potential improvement. And I think one of the things that I alluded to earlier is one of our challenges is always, I don't know the benefits that are going to come out of generative AI before I do any testing or before I model it on my specific customers. And to folks getting stuck in that piece of the evaluation, what I would say is think about changing the question. Instead of saying, what is going to happen? What are the improvements I'm going to experience? The question you should be asking is, what do I need to believe to invest in this use case? Right? And what that's allowing you to do, it's allowing you to think about this more as a mathematical equation and the realm of possibilities. And what I would strongly recommend is take a few different scenarios. So don't just anchor on one, but look at a couple of different scenarios. You can also see how sensitive your ROI or your revenue calculations are to the different assumptions that you're making. And I kind of led with that, but what this is referred to is a sensitivity analysis. And from my personal experience, what I like to do is think of it as 3 different scenarios. There's your base case, and this is where you want to think about your most likely outcome, probably where you want to spend most of your time looking at benchmark analysis, looking at potentially other use cases that you've tested this on. So as a partner, this is a great area where you can add a lot of value, looking at other scenarios or other customers where you've applied generative AI to similar use cases and seeing the relative value. Customers internally look at different tests you've run over the years. Doesn't have to be generative AI specific, and look at the high-end potential of where you've seen an email campaign be extremely successful. And you want to apply that to your base case. And then from there, you want to say, okay, well, what's the worst case scenario? Whether it's 0 incremental value or a very limited incremental value. And then you want to have an upside scenario. So you can start to get a sense of the range of value that you might be able to derive from investing in Gen AI. And the goal here is to really get a sense of the total risk with your downside and the total potential, and then have an educated conversation with your stakeholders, your customers, if you're a partner, and say, what are they willing to bear that risk for the potential upside? So what you can see here is tweaking the metrics around open rate and conversion rate can dramatically change or influence your potential revenue lift, going all the way from 4.4 million in this example to 18.2 million. So now I'm going to take a moment and actually talk a little bit more about how we came up with those ranges, or let me phrase it, how we came up with the revenue lift and then how we came up with the ranges. So as I talked about, it's really important to take a metric and be able to convert that to an actual dollar value. So in this case, we went through and we understood the mechanics of the campaign, right? So what's critical here is the number of customers in an email campaign. So how many customers are you actually touching? The open rate. The number of customers who will open is a factor of those 2 numbers. And then if they will go into the store, which is a factor of the conversion rate. and then you want to apply a ticket size to that. So if you take those two numbers and you apply your base case scenario, or let me rephrase that, your current state scenario, so that's 20% is what your customers experience or what you're experiencing today, with a 1% conversion rate, on average, an email campaign gets you 15,000. If you can prove or see with generative AI that you see a 50% improvement in open rates, so going from 20% to 30%, and 100% improvement from conversion rates, so going from 1% to 2%, that has the potential to increase your campaign by $30,000. On an average, this customer is running 100 campaigns per year. Also, you want to look at this over a longer time horizon. You don't want to look at this over necessarily just one campaign, but we specifically looked at this over 3 years because it takes time to think about your ROI investment or your upfront cost investment that Salman will talk about in a few minutes over a longer period of time. You also want to think about how your generative AI output, or in this case, your operating metrics of open rate and conversion rate are probably going to need to improve over time and get smarter as your Gen AI tools get better and more familiar with your own data and your own learnings from original campaigns or initial campaigns. So this is an example of how you take operational metrics and you get to a revenue number to be able to really start to think about ROI. And as I mentioned, there's a reason we looked at this over 3 years. So one of the things that we wanted to double click into is that whole understanding of what our base case scenario and how we got to these improvement rates. And what you'll see, and this is very, very common, what you'll see is a starting point. So in this case, this is what we experienced in our building and testing POC in this fictitious example, which is a nominal improvement over what you're seeing and experiencing without generative AI. And then as you progress over the 3 years, you should see a continuous improvement in what you're experiencing in those operational metrics, and you'll continue to see improvements in the ROI and the value. And so we wanted to highlight this because as you look at costs in a minute, if you look at this in a very narrow lens, you're going to have challenges in seeing the total ROI, which is why today when people in their early journey of adopting generative AI, they're saying, look, we're still investing, we're still evaluating if the investment is worth it. It's because it takes time to fully recoup that investment. So as you look at your ROI modeling, you want to think about how your operational metrics and your total revenue actually grows over time. So that gives you kind of a high level overview of how you want to think about approaching the business value component of it and some of our best practices as we've seen working with partners and customers directly. And now I'm going to hand it over to Salman to talk more about the cost lens of it.
Thank you, Priya. So cost, I think Priya highlighted earlier that there are some architectural choices that impact this, right? There are 3 things in simple terms that is important to consider. And when we talk about direct costs, we mean the cost that is associated with the infrastructure of running these generative AI applications. The first one is the choice of foundation model. Now, at the outset, you might have an anticipation of which foundation model is relevant, and that's okay. You can start off, doing some guess estimation around the ROI. But as Priya highlighted, ROI exercise is not a point in time. It needs to continue. So as you go through your POC, you're going to be looking at a handful of most relevant foundation models and select the one that is most relevant and fit for purpose for that use case. In particular, the advice that we have is that you should probably identify the foundation model that is the smallest yet performs well enough for your particular use case, right? One of the advantages of focusing on some of the smaller models, they often are more cost effective. They're also much better in terms of latency of the response, so you get responses faster. And also research has shown that they tend to be easier to contextualize for a specific narrow application, right? But again, there are certainly use cases that would require the larger models as well, but it's really best practice to go through evaluation of these models, and that's where our Amazon Bedrock evaluation service comes into play, where you have an anticipation at the outset, you do some guess estimations, you go through an evaluation, you identify the right one, you revisit your ROI, you refine these estimates. And that's how you should be doing all the time, right? Even as you end the POC, you look at what's been identified, what are the data points, what are the insights, how does that impact the ROI, and you keep on refining this estimate over the 3 years that we talked about. And we'll talk about why 3 years. The second one is around the demand profile, the volume of requirements, these inference. It could be the case that it's ad hoc usage, in which case you probably go with an on-demand API invocation-based, consumption-based pricing. If it's a case that is constant, maybe you look at a throughput inference option for that. If there are cases where the response is not time sensitive and you have bulk, you should consider batch inference. So selecting the right inference option for your demand profile that you anticipate is going to have an impact on the costing of that. The third aspect is the customization. And again, there are a number of options. People think of customization just about fine-tuning, but that's not the only option, right? So without fine-tuning, you can present a lot of examples as part of the prompt. It's called the in-context learning and providing those examples as part of the prompt. But the downside is you're going to have a longer prompt, and that input prompt is going to be used every single time that you have an inference request. So you need to weigh the options. Am I going to have a longer prompt? What's the implication of that from a pricing perspective? But if I fine-tune the model, then I can probably shorten that prompt. I don't need to have all of those examples in the prompt. But then there's slightly shift in that cost where you need to maintain and manage a model that is customized and unique to you. The third aspect is the RAG, right? So you may be retrieving information from other sources. There are costs associated with doing similarity search, vector database, creating those embeddings and whatnot. So looking at those choices again is going to have an impact on your infrastructure costs of running these models. And that's just about the generative AI part of it. In addition, there's also the data cleansing, data preparation that is going to be needed in order to bring the relevant data in order to execute that. So you need to bear in mind some of those choices, and in many cases, these choices need to be reviewed as part of a successful POC. To come out of it to say, this is actually what we've learned, these are the best practices, these are the ones that we would advise moving to production. Now, moving on to highlighting how this would play out against the illustrative scenario that we showed with the personalized marketing campaign. We're going to have data storage cost, right? And this is going to grow. The reason it's going to grow is because it's pre-highlighted. You start off with a smaller number of emails per campaign, but as you go, scale to year 1, 2, and 3, you're going to have more emails. You're going to have customer data in order to create that personalized outcome, right? So there's going to be more data involved. So you need to be looking at that customer storage perspective. The second aspect is looking at the cleansing preparation of the data points. And again, you probably put more effort upfront in order to figure out what's the logic, what's the mechanics of making this data, preparing it for this use case. Once you've identified it, you probably find more efficient ways of automating it for the BAU and long-time operation of this solution. We talked about the foundation model cost, right? So selecting the right one, doing an anticipation of what kind of inference cost you're going to be realizing with that, that's going to be becoming also part of the equation. Now, what you note here is that there's an upfront line, and then there's basically annual cost. I'm not calling the upfront cost as a POC cost because I feel it's the investment you're making for the long term, right? You're preparing this solution, you're preparing all of these architectures, you're preparing the infrastructure for long-term usage of this. It's not just for the duration of the POC. It's going to be incurred during the POC, for sure, but it shouldn't be seen as just for the POC. It needs to be looked at long-term. And it's important because it's relatively high cost. It's going to be amortized over the time, and that's important to highlight to business leaders and as part of your ROI calculation and the business case. So in this scenario, as you can see, you look at the annual cost. What is it that we're going to have as a run cost? How many years we're going to be looking at this ROI? Could be 3 years, could be 5 years, could be longer. Multiply the number by that. And then you add the upfront costs. What's the cost that's going to be realized at the start in order to get the solution going and implement it on the infrastructure. Now, the second aspect is the indirect cost. And this is where we mean the non-infra part associated with this solution. It's going to come from engineering effort that is needed in order to build the solution. Again, that's relatively higher upfront because you need to build the solution, but it's going to be relatively less costly as you just maintain it and you improve it over time. Change management is an important one. It's one that we certainly see that often is overlooked. It's one that perhaps not having it would mean you're more cost efficient, but actually it has a direct attribution to the revenue realization, to the scaling and the adoption of these solutions in the organization. So it's very important to focus around how do you engage the business users on this journey of GenAI adoption? How do you make sure that the metrics and KPIs that Priya highlighted earlier are relevant to the business? They're meaningful to the business. Because if they're not, then once you come out of the POC and you do the ROI calculation, they're going to be looking at it saying, well, actually, these are probably not the right metrics, KPIs for us. Security risk, highly important from a responsible AI, from compliance, from regulatory, from the aspects of hallucination, transparency, explainability. And these are, again, upfront, you would encounter them, but also it's ongoing because you want to make sure that you can look at the hallucination of these models and you mitigate those risks. You can continuously look at the compliance aspect of it, right? And in fact, this is one bucket where even human oversight should be considered. So what's the cost of that human oversight, the human in the loop? Highlight that as part of the security risk. The training and upskilling is different to the engineering effort. This is more intended for the business users, for the organization, right? With these solutions, you're probably going to need new roles. You need to upskill people in order to understand these solutions, manage these solutions, improve them, maybe as prompt engineers, maybe as bot managers and whatnot, right? How do you need to invest upfront in order to educate them around this technology? And what is the effort needed, the cost associated with continuously keeping them up to date around this so that they can actually contribute and feel a sense of ownership of this solution in business? So as you can see, again, there are two line items. There's some costs associated upfront, and there's annual costs. We don't call the upfront cost as a POC cost because that cost is going to be amortized, and it's also going to have value, and it's going to be required for the long term, right? So it's better to be called upfront cost as opposed to a POC cost. Now, coming back to the sensitivity analysis that Priya highlighted, this is where it all comes together, right? So we had the base case, we had the upside, we had the downside, we had the different numbers associated with the revenue lift. Now we have the cost, right? And the cost remains the same if the number of campaigns, customers, emails remain the same, right? So if you have the choices, you make the choices, do the estimation. And based on that, you're going to realize different net returns and different ROIs. And these are the ROIs that people look at, the business leaders look at. And it's not uncommon for business leaders to look at the most conservative estimate in order to make an investment decision, but actually plan for the most likely scenario, which is a base case, right? And that makes sense. Now, talking about the 3-year horizon, why is that? So we talked about the cost, and as you saw, you noted, it's a high cost. It's relatively high when you look at some of the upfront costs, right? So at the very start, the returns is certainly not going to be matching the cost that is incurred. But as you move over time, two things happen that allow the returns to outpace the cost. The first one is that you scale and you use this technology in more scenarios for more campaigns, more emails, more customers. So you get to see more returns due to scaling factor. And on that scaling factor, the cost of scaling it is relatively lower. So you're going to see more returns coming on for each one of those scaling steps. The second aspect is that even the efficiency, the effectiveness of the solution is going to be improved because you're going to have more feedback. You incorporate those feedbacks into your solution. You improve that solution over time. So it starts with a X percentage of accuracy, but over time, that goes higher and higher and improves with your more insights, with more knowledge, with more data points that is gathered around that solution. So that is the reason why often we see that these ROIs need to be looked at over a number of years as opposed to just the first year or the POC. It just doesn't make sense for you to look at it from that perspective. It just doesn't add up. And 3 to 5 year horizon seems to be common. That's the horizon that you should be looking at in order to do that. And then when you look at that, so you can see the equation here, right? So it's the 9 million. That is the revenue uplift. You deduct the cost, 2.2 million. You divide it by the 2.2 million, the cost again. So you've got a 3-to-1 ratio around the ROI. Now, what I want to talk about is some of the pitfalls, some of the areas where things don't go as expected, or they're miscalculated, overinflated, or underestimated. And the nice thing is that we can actually show it on the equation quantitatively, right? So when it comes to the business value, sometimes we see overestimation of value potential. In some cases, we see an overestimation of the speed to realizing that value. And I'll cover these in the following slides. And similarly, when it comes to costs, we see over-engineering of the use case affecting the direct cost. Or in the sense of indirect cost, an underestimation of change management is going to be impacting this. So if I move on to just double click on each one of them, with regards to the value, overestimating the speed to value, 2 factors are important in order to realize how quickly you can realize the value and you can scale. The first one is organizational readiness, and that really ties to the adoption, to the change management effort that has happened. And the second one is the data readiness. Now, this slide highlights the change management aspect, but I want to tell you about the data readiness and how sometimes we encounter these POCs and these projects which actually hit this pitfall. As part of the POC, people gather the data, comes together, they look at the data, they realize, oh my God, my data is not fully accurate. Maybe it's out of date, maybe it has gaps. You bring an SME, the SME looks at it and says, fine, so these are probably 100 line items. That's fine. Manually, I'll go through them. I'll fix this. The data is fixed, cleaned up, accurate, goes through the POC. POC comes out, flying colors. Everybody loves it. Fantastic. You're like, okay, database set up, integration set up, foundation model set up. Hit go. Let's go into production. Realize, oh, wow. That guy who was fixing data, now that data is not just 100 lines. It's like 10,000 lines, right? What do we learn from that? How has that been incorporated into the solution? So those are some of the areas where we see in the scope of POC, some assumptions have been made, or efforts have been put in that when it comes to production scale, they've been missed. And that kind of data readiness slows the scaling. And that has an impact on basically, as I said, overestimating that speed to value where it's actually going to be much slower because you still need SME input. Or you would need to translate that SME input into a logic, business logic that can be implemented. The second aspect is overestimating value. And we see this for mainly 2 reasons. One is AI is just not perfect. It's still probabilistic. It's not 100% accurate. So it's important to keep that in mind and manage expectations. In fact, even humans are not 100% perfect, right? We see many business process functions where humans are operating, but there are QA, QC processes on top. There are oversights that are happening, checks and balances. All of that tells that even humans are not just 100%. So in the same way that humans need an oversight, QA, QC processes, same with AI. That's required. And it's important to realize that. So as part of your calculation and estimations, you shouldn't be assuming that you can actually attain 100% accuracy. The second part where we see sometimes this emerge and come up is where we have customers focusing on some of the use cases around cost saving or automation of business processes. And with those, what's often happened is that previous technologies, RPA, automation, cognitive automation, classic AI/ML, has already been evolved, already been adopted. So if you look at the whole business process, maybe 60 or 70% of that is already automated. What happens then? Then you're bringing this sophisticated technology, generative AI, in order to tackle just that 30%. So you're having marginal returns as a result of it, because even that 30%, as I highlighted, you're not going to be able to attain the full 100%. So those are some of the insights that, sometimes customers, businesses moving into these POCs, they realize, because upfront they look at the business process, they say, hey, this looks obvious, this is a fantastic candidate for generative AI, but when they get closer to the end of the POC, they realize, actually, there are other players, other systems already in play, and some aspects of that has been automated. So then now, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're willing to take a step back and reimagine the entire process? Or are we going to be just focusing on those 30%? So those are some of the healthy conversations to be had up front, but those are the areas where it could be issues where you could overestimate the value as part of the process.
And I would just add here too, it's okay to say a use case is not the right place to invest in generative AI. We saw that a lot early on, and I think some of the challenges that customers have faced that were early to adopt was not finding that right use case. So I think going through this analysis, and as much as this is to identify and make the business case for the right use case, it's also to take the time and eliminate where you shouldn't be investing the resources up front or early on in your generative AI journey.
100%. Okay, let's talk about the cost side, right? Some of the pitfalls we're seeing. Over-engineering the use case. So I think it's really good when an engineering team wants to really dive deep and understand the technology. That's really good. But when it comes to wanting a high degree of control, customization, flexibility, that's where things can become an over-engineering aspect of it, right? And two things I talk about. Number one, you need to keep agility in mind. Some of the engineering teams who want to really customize and squeeze performance and optimize, I'm like, that's fine. But that should probably be your version 4, The minimum viable product needs to be something simple. You need to get it off the ground, right? And then over time, as you learn more, it's fine to customize it and make it better and more optimized and have more control and more freedom. And that's where actually our generative AI 3-layer stack also makes sense. You've got Amazon Q at the high level, very simple to adopt, but as soon as you want to squeeze for more performance, you can come down to the next layer of Amazon Bedrock. You use Amazon Bedrock and you say, okay, I'm happy with this, I've realized some returns, but I want to actually optimize for more performance. I want more, that's fine. You come down to the next layer, Amazon SageMaker is available, right? And in fact, if you look at our features, there are a good bit of overlap, intentionally so that when you shift from one to the next, you can reuse as much code as possible, and you can add code only in order to customize that. But as I said, it has to be, agility needs to be the key point here, in order to start off with something simple and then build more complexity into it. The second aspect is that modularity, right? So Priya and I do a lot of customer roundtables and panels as well. One of the recent ones, a customer raised their hand. They said, listen, we're using model provider X. Now we hear in the market about model provider Y. And the question is, should we be investing time in order to get access to that model provider Y? Because everybody's talking about it. And I was like, yes, it's early days. There's a lot happening. This technology is evolving fast. So you should certainly keep your options open. However, I can't help but notice that by the time you invest and get access to model provider Y, there's going to be model provider Z coming up, right? So maybe the smarter thing is that you should invest and get access to a platform where the vendor just takes care of the business, identifies the right leading foundation model providers, and brings it to you, and then you basically invest once and access that platform. If you get to a certain point that you want to take more control and customization, that's fine, right? But to begin with, that's a smarter investment. And that's where, again, our Amazon Bedrock platform comes into play, because we identify, we bring it, all of these leading model providers, we keep it up to date, so that people don't have to spend effort and investments in order to gain access to each one of these model providers, or encounter the risk of what happens if I need to ship my data each time to each one of these model providers.
And I would add to that it gets even more important when you start looking at multiple use cases. So when you're looking at an individual use case, we talked about reevaluating your design choices, your ROI as the models mature, but you're also going to want to think about, how do I pull on different models for different use cases when you're optimizing for different performance criteria as well.
Yeah. So on the last point, change management. So you've probably heard of the phrase, data is king. And I think data is king if it's good quality, right? Because within the business environment, as soon as you look at the data, and the data is not good quality, it's got gaps, it's outdated, whatnot, what do? You ask the business user, you ask the employee, because they probably know the answer, right? They probably know how to fix that. Employees are a great asset for any business. And in many cases, they show this resistance to change because of that uncertainty that they see with these technologies. One of the best advice that I have for customers and partners is that when you try to plan your generative AI POC, before you start day one, have a day zero. Have a half-day workshop with the business users who are about to be affected. Set it up transparently, tell the business users, this is a business hypothesis we're going to be testing. If it fails, we will lose X amount of costs, and that's acceptable to us. But more importantly, we will learn something. In many cases, we see that organizations learn more about their own organization, their people, their data, and sometimes about the technology as well. But it's not always about technology. There are a lot of values in doing these experiments and POCs and encountering on these innovation cycles. And then also say, well, if this business hypothesis does succeed, what's going to happen is that this is what's going to be likely in terms of day two, how it's going to be coming to operation and how it's going to be managed. It's not going to be perfect. There's going to be a life cycle management. There are new roles that we're going to need. There are new ways of working. And in fact, for those roles, here are some of the online training that is available, right? Highlight that to the business user up front. Give them that option. And you'll be surprised how easily those naysayers and people who are resisting change suddenly become champions of change because they can see their own role, how they could upskill themselves and be part of that journey with you. And I think that's super valuable when it comes to change management.
And I would say, kind of sitting down and talking to our partners, this is where they've seen actually one of the biggest blockers to adoption is the POC went well, the technology worked, everything lined up and everything in theory should be working, but the adoption is limited because they haven't invested or the customer didn't have a plan for a change management program to drive utilization. So I think this is a really, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the areas that we tend to overlook in cost estimation, but I actually think it's one of the areas we tend to overlook in investing, and it's one that we would highly recommend to really realize the long-term value for your generative AI investments.
So next slide is on Priya telling us where we can learn more about this.
So I teased this a little bit at the beginning, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm the global lead for the Generative AI Center of Excellence, and this is a resource specifically available to our AWS partners. And what it does is it provides resources. So for example, we have ROI and pricing calculators for AWS partners on there with our latest insights, tools, and the same resources that our own field sales teams use, as well as up-to-date training and content on our new services and features. Because as I mentioned earlier, as we've both talked about, this landscape is changing so quickly that we want to make sure that our partners have the latest and greatest assets. And this is why they're highly valuable to our customers, because they are investing the time to make sure that they stay abreast of all the new announcements that come out, the new features, and the best practices. Also available in here for our AWS partners is going to be a lot of the market research that we've referenced today and alluded to. So every year, the Generative AI COE invests in researching and understanding customer adoption trends, both in the use cases they're prioritizing, their buying journey, and how they think about working with AWS partners. So I strongly recommend our AWS partners in the room to come check out the hub, leverage it as you build your go-to-market strategies and your investment areas for generative AI, and I strongly recommend the customers in the room to find an AWS partner that you trust and that you can work with on your generative AI adoption journey. Okay, we'll be here for a few more minutes if anybody has any questions. Apologies we couldn't get to all of them, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.